The topic we shall be discussing today is the book review. This lecture is aimed at developing an understanding of how to write and structure a book review. We shall also learn certain theoretical foundations in the course of this lecture. We will endeavor to develop certain strategies for balanced and unbiased evaluation of material. And finally, we shall try to understand the expectations of the audience and how to write an audience-oriented review. The first part of our discussion addresses the book review. We shall begin with the purpose of writing the book review. Thereafter, we shall discuss the expectations of the audience or the reader. We shall also evaluate key analytical tools for writing a book review. And finally, we shall deliberate upon the role of the book review in academic discourse. The first question that we must address is, what is a book review? What do we mean by a book review? A book review is often described as a brief, evaluative summary of a book that has been printed and published. Yet, this definition is simplistic. There are many complexities which we must deal with while writing and reading a book review. What is the function of a book review? What is the role of a book review in academic writing? A book review must be understood as operating at a critical intersection. The intersection between literary criticism, communication, and discourse production. It is a form of mediation between the text and the potential readers. So therefore, the book reviewer plays the role of a mediator between the text and the readers of the text. While writing the book review, the reviewer also engages in the act of interpretation. Interpretation often involves his own ideological, cultural, and methodological positioning. Now, among the many theorists who have written about narratology, foremost among them is the French critic Gérard Genette. Genette's concept of the text and the paratext could be a useful paradigm for understanding the function of the book review. According to Genette, the paratext is everything surrounding a core text. That is, it shapes meaning as well as reception. Gérard uses a technical term to define this. He calls it the threshold or vestibule. This could include titles, author names, prefaces, which Genette regards as the peritext, but it could also involve, very importantly, reviews, interviews, and blurbs. The book, therefore, or the text, is mediated to the public through the paratext. The book review in this context could be regarded as a kind of paratext, because a text cannot exist without the paratext. The book review provides the readers an understanding of what lies within the text. So therefore, in order to guide interpretation, to make the text more concrete from an abstract entity, to make the text or the book a concrete public object, the book review plays a vital role. And as Genette argues, it could be considered as a kind of paratext. The book review functions as a paratext also because it conditions the expectations of the audience. And essentially, it helps in the construction of meaning. Meaning formation or meaning construction occurs through the book review. The literary value of the book can also be gauged by the kind of book reviews that are written and published on it. So therefore, the book review is a critical form because it negotiates the tension between the summary and the criticism. It cannot simply be a summary of the book in question. It must also engage in criticism. These are the two essential components of a book review. Now, moving on, we must also evaluate the function of the reviewer. While some reviewer may provide a narrative or a conceptual orientation, the purpose of the book review is not to reproduce the text. One cannot reproduce the text in the book review. The book review is a separate entity. It is a kind of commentary on the book. So therefore, the reviewer must never attempt to reproduce the text, but rather to interpret it, to provide a unique interpretation of the book. From the perspective of structuralism, which is a key literary theory, there are various elements or characteristics in a book. For instance, when we think about a book, the first few issues that immediately draw our attention are the plot, the character, the themes, as well as the stylistic features and genre. If we take up reading a book, these are the 5 elements that immediately draw our attention. It grips the readers. In structuralism, these are called semiotic elements. The book reviewer can attempt to analyze how the interaction of these 5 features can produce meaning. The book reviewer must closely examine these 5 characteristics: plot, character, themes, stylistic elements, and genre. These 5 elements must be carefully evaluated by the book reviewer in the process of interpretation. And this will help in the production of meaning. It is also important that the book reviewer engages in selective representation. To put it very simply, a book review cannot tell us everything about a book. It can only foreground, it can only prepare readers for what is in the book. So therefore, the book reviewer must be selective. There are certain textual components which must be prioritized over others. So if we consider the book review as a critical thesis, the role or the function of the reviewer is to select the material, to select textual components upon which one can critically comment. In this regard, we must understand that there are various models of communication that could be helpful. Roman Jakobson, for instance, proposes a theory of communication which could further elaborate on the function of the book reviewer. Jakobson argues that the reviewer acts as a mediator, and in this process of mediation, there are elements which are included and excluded. So there are particular codes and signifiers that the book reviewer uses in order to guide the interpretation of the readers. In this way, the message that is communicated to the reader is different from one book review to the other. No 2 book reviews can be alike. While they are commenting on the same book, 2 book reviews can be very different in terms of the nature and style of writing, primarily because it is the book reviewer who determines the codes and the signifiers and the textual components that are highlighted in the review. So therefore, we must understand that a book review is not purely descriptive commentary. There has to be the presence of an argument. The book review must argue or present the argument of the reviewer. And through the book review, the reviewer must establish the efficacy and the cultural significance of the book. To move on, when we talk about criticism, we understand that the act of judgment is central to the review. Any kind of criticism is a kind of judgment. We must also consider that a book deeply moves its readers. There is an affective response that it can evoke. However, while writing a review, the book reviewer must be very cautious to avoid any kind of affective response and to engage in an unbiased, objective criticism of the book. He must therefore focalize attention on features which are objective, which the readers would be able to identify on their own. The emotions may not translate through the book review. However, if it is an objective criticism, that could be easily identified by the readers when they are engaging with the text. So therefore, it is important for the book reviewer to have logic and argumentation. There must be a process of logical reasoning that must be evinced through the book review. There must also be accuracy of evidence. Only then can it genuinely contribute to the production of meaning. It cannot be an affect-driven response that is expressed through the book review. Regardless of the genre, the reviewer must establish his credibility. There must be a rational evaluation. At the same time, it is important for the reviewer to evoke a sense of excitement among the readers to read the book. The book review must excite the readers. It must prompt them to take up reading the book. So therefore, the reviewer must position himself as a neutral observer whose authority is derived from critical inquiry and rigor instead of affect or emotion. To elaborate further on the book review, we must also try to bring into discussion Pierre Bourdieu's concept of the literary field. While this is a complex theory, we can try to simplify it by considering literature as an autonomous, hierarchical field of power and struggle. What Bourdieu tries to establish is that any kind of literature is an autonomous, independent, and hierarchical field of power and struggle, where authors and works compete for cultural legitimacy. They compete to achieve a kind of cultural prominence. This cultural legitimacy or cultural prominence is a kind of symbolic capital. The author is not purely driven by economic needs. So it is not economic profit or financial profit that he is seeking. But the writer uses several strategic methods wherein the book can produce a kind of cultural capital. So therefore, in a book, the space that is negotiated by the author is complex because he is not only motivated to write, on the basis of his own aesthetic judgment. But he must also consider external pressures. He must also keep in mind the commercial success of the book as well as the kind of cultural value that it will generate. This is how Pierre Bourdieu examines the concept of the literary field. And therefore, any kind of discourse on the book, for instance, a book review, can also contribute towards creating a kind of cultural value that is associated with the book. There are certain books that are canonized more than others. There are certain books which are more popular than others, that receive more public attention than others. This process is called canon formation. There are certain books which are considered more mainstream, others which may be regarded as niche. So therefore, the book reviewer plays a critical function in this regard, because the review also determines the reception of the book. Whether the book is well appreciated or well received very often depends on the nature of the review that the book produces. To further elaborate with the help of an example, any kind of consumer review which is available on digital platforms, if we purchase a book through a digital platform, very often we scroll through the reviews of customers. Now, these reviews are very democratic because anybody who has purchased the book or read through the book can post a review. It is a digital platform, it is free for all. Therefore, this kind of review is less formalized. But while writing a book review, whether for a newspaper or for a digital platform, one must be cautious about the kind of cultural value that one attributes to the book, because it will determine in the future the kind of canonization that the book may or may not experience. Now, there are several complexities while writing a book review. A very important theoretical complexity arises from the expectation of the reviewer. The reviewer must maintain critical distance. At the same time, a review would not be interesting if the reviewer is unable to express his own subjective interpretation. If there is no subjective interpretation in a book review, it would be a dull read. It would not create any kind of excitement among the reader. There is a theory, a literary theory called the reader response theory, which insists that meaning is constructed through the interaction between the text and the reader. Any kind of interaction between the text and the reader can produce discourse. It can produce meaning. So from the lens of the reader response theory, we can argue that no review has universal objectivity. No review can claim to have universal objectivity because the review is a product of an interaction. The reviewer reads the book and writes the review. And through this interaction, there is some kind of interpretation or meaning formation that occurs. So therefore, the reviewer cannot claim to be completely objective because he is engaged in a subjective interpretation of the text. However, the reviewer must be transparent about the interpretive framework that he has used while writing the review. That could depend on the ideological positioning of the reviewer, whether or not he has used a Marxist or a psychoanalytic or a feminist perspective while unpacking the layers of meaning in the text. This transparency must exist because it enables the readers to contextualize the judgments that are present in the book review. So therefore, one cannot prioritize one over the other. Subjectivity and objectivity both must be expressed through the book review. It is important for the book reviewer to balance both. Now, if we come to the question of how to write a book review, are there any important points that we must remember while writing a book review? The first is conciseness. It is very important for the book reviewer to be concise while writing a review. It should generate a kind of intellectual curiosity among the readers to read the book. If one says everything about the book in the review, nobody would read the book. So the review is typically a compressed analysis. It's a precise, concise analysis. And if one engages in writing a book review, one must focus on maintaining a tight structure. This would also require a degree of prioritization and precision. One must prioritize some facts over the other. Some features must be highlighted at the cost of others. And there must be precision in the style of writing. The reviewer must decide what are the textual features that best reveal the strengths and the weaknesses of the book. He must also foreground the kind of interpretive conflicts that could arise from the reading of the text. What is also very useful while writing a book review is to enunciate the contextual elements of the book. If the reviewer focuses upon the context and provides the reader a background to the book, it could enable the reader to understand the book better. In this regard, we will remember the theory of adaptation that was proposed by Linda Hutcheon. Linda Hutcheon suggests that any act of representation is creative, independent. She talks about in her book, A Theory of Adaptation, which was published in 2006. She talks about the process of adaptation. Any process of adaptation is creative, independent. It is an intertextual process. And Hutcheon warns us against considering an adaptation as a kind of derivative work. She analyzes adaptations across various media, books, films, opera, games, and she talks about how the act or the process of interpretation in itself becomes a kind of adaptation. As soon as I interpret a book, it becomes inevitably an act of adaptation. I am adapting the meaning of the book to write a book review. So therefore, this adaptation must be viewed as a transposition, a work of reinterpretation. And that is what the book review endeavors to do. Compressing the text inevitably means that some meaning is excluded, but at the same time, it could also generate new insight into the book. It could also generate new layers of meaning which the readers can later focus upon. So interpretation and adaptation go hand in hand. According to Linda Hutcheon, the act of interpreting a book is also implicitly an act of adaptation. And that is what happens while writing a book review. The review also operates as a site of intertextuality. Now, this is another technical term which was coined by Julia Kristeva, who was a famous French feminist. Kristeva argues that every text enters into a network of meaning. Now, she coined this particular term intertextuality, and she proposed that no text can stand alone. It is not an independent or separate entity, but it exists within a web of meaning. It is a tissue of quotations. It is a kind of mosaic of other texts, a patchwork of other texts, ideas, and existing cultural codes. So any kind of book is constantly referencing or transforming or building upon a pre-existing discourse. And this makes it a dynamic process. So the reader's own textual experience also plays an important role, because when one reads the book, he does not do so in isolation. While reading a book, immediately the memory of a pre-existing book may be evoked in the mind of the reader. And this is what the reviewer must attempt to do. The reviewer, to improve his writing, could draw intertextual references, include intertextual references to further enhance his writing, to make it more critical and more effective for the readers. So this is Julia Kristeva's theory of intertextuality, how a text enters a network of previous dialogues is important, and the reviewer must evaluate the work in relation to the conventions of the genre. Every genre has certain conventions, whether it is science fiction, whether it is a detective novel. There are certain established literary conventions. So the book reviewer, while reading the book, could draw into focus the conventions, the literary conventions that could guide the understanding of the reader. The book reviewer could also refer to historical precedents, could foreground certain literary theories. These are tools that the book reviewer provides the readers to better understand the book. For example, a new dystopian novel that is published might be analyzed in relation to seminal works such as George Orwell's 1984 or Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. A monograph in sociology or anthropology could be examined in relation to existing paradigms, existing theoretical frameworks in the discipline. So by situating a book within a broader intellectual genealogy or within a broader intellectual environment, the reviewer can articulate the relevance of the book. He could also comment on the originality of thought expressed in the book. And very importantly, the reviewer could also predict the potential impact of the book on the audience. The potential impact on future discourse could also be determined if one keeps in mind the contextual framework and other texts that could speak with the existing text to understand it better. So in this sense, the book review can also construct cultural memory. It could guide the evolution of meaning, the construction of meaning. And this brings us to the end of our book review. To make this more engaging, let us have a short quiz. The first question is, according to Gérard Genette, what does the book review function as? If you recall our discussion on Gérard Genette's theory of narratology, you will remember that Gérard Genette brings in two very important terms into discussion. One is the text, and to answer the question, the paratext. So Gérard Genette considers the book review as a paratext. It functions as a paratext. Moving on to the next question. What is the theory that Linda Hutcheon proposed that can help us understand the function of the book review? To revisit Hutcheon's idea, we must remember that Hutcheon talks about interpretation and adaptation, that any act of interpretation is an act of adaptation. So the answer to this question is the theory proposed by Linda Hutcheon is the theory of adaptation. And finally, the third question is that who proposed the idea of intertextuality? This is something that we have discussed very recently. So you would remember that the idea of intertextuality was proposed by the very famous French feminist critic, Julia Kristeva. So in conclusion, we may argue that the book review transcends the boundaries of summary or personal opinion. It is a theoretically rich act of mediation. We have referred to several theoretical perspectives which are grounded in narratology, rhetoric, discourse theory, cultural criticism. So reviews contextualize texts and they shape possibilities of interpretation. They can also evaluate contributions to literary and intellectual fields. So one must not consider the book review as a peripheral academic exercise. In academic writing, the book review is a vital paratextual practice that can sustain a dialogue between writers, readers, between words, texts, and their reception.